6. I am David Allowance, and I'm interviewing Mr. Ed Wyrick, W-Y-R-I-C-K, at the Atlanta History Center for the World War II Veterans History Project. Mr. Wyrick is a native of Missouri, and he grew up in the Depression out in the Midwest, and had an interesting career in the military and after the military. And he's going to talk to us about what it was like growing up at those times, how he got a job, got interested in flying, and what he did during his military career. And Ed, we appreciate you being here more than I can tell you, and I'm going to turn you loose and turn you on, so start talking.
All right. Thank you, sir. Well, I'm going to begin with my first airplane ride. I was a 6-year-old boy in Missouri farm, at my grandfather's farm. One evening, biplane circled our farm and landed in a pasture we had just freshly mowed.
What year was that?
And this was 1927. I was about 6 and a half. I was the summer that I would have been 7 years old that fall. But anyway, he landed on our farm, and because it was getting dark, and he had come from Wichita and was going to Marshall, Missouri, where they had an aircraft factory down there to getting parts. It was a new airplane, and I think since that time I've determined it was a travel air that was made in Wichita. Anyway, he spent the night at our farm, which was a real experience, and the next morning he took us for a ride, and my aunt and I rode together, and then he took my grandfather up. My grandfather went with him then to Marshall that morning. But anyway, that was my first airplane ride, and I had an interest in aviation. The rest of a good bit of my growing up days was in Kansas. I went to first and second grade in Missouri, and then went over to Kansas. The rest of my grade school years till I was a senior, and then we went to Joplin, Missouri, where I graduated from high school. And while I was in and I went to junior college in Joplin, and I had 2 years of junior college, and I just finished that 2-year college, and I went to the school to get a football to play with, but we couldn't afford to buy one. It was Depression days, and my coach had said he'd loan us one. And while I was there, one of my professors knew that I'd had an interest in flying, and he said, Ed, why don't you check on this flight course that's starting? Well, I found out that since then, what all went behind getting this through Congress and everything, this type of training. President Roosevelt had difficulty getting financing for the Air Corps, and there were several different make-work programs during this Depression time, and they decided that if they trained a whole lot of pilots, it would help the economy for buying airplanes. And there was no thought of training for military duty, because for one thing, the country had been very pacifist and anti-war since World War I, so it was difficult to get people to approve anything like that would be training war, even though the war in Europe was starting. So I checked into that, and I took a physical. And this was, ground school was set up in the colleges, flight training out of the local fixed base operator at the airport. Had to work it in your regular college schedule. I was still going to college another year, so had to work it in with my schedule. Another thing, at that time, some statistics I've read since then, the Air Corps is training about 200 pilots a year, and we were going to need, President Roosevelt decided we really needed to train a bunch of pilots. So I was selected for this program. This program had 30 students, the one I was in, which was the second one. The first group was a demonstration program in about 13 colleges throughout the United States. One of them was Georgia Tech. After the demonstration program, then there were about 435 colleges participated in this program. After the first elementary program, the primary program, you had about 35 hours, you got your private license, and out of those 30, 10% had to be women, so we had 3 girls in our class, plus the 27 guys. Out of those 30, 10 were chosen to take the secondary course. And that was in a, we had an old Traveler, which was similar to that one I had my first ride in. And it was a biplane, and we did acrobatics in that. We learned to do all the acrobatics.
What was the horsepower of those engines?
That horsepower was 225 Wright engine. There was a good airplane. The Waco was really a popular airplane for that kind of work. But this guy was able to get him to approve this old Traveler, which cost about $1,000. A new Waco cost about $8,000. So he was paid by the government to train us. Now, we didn't pay any money for this flight training. It was all paid for by the government.
What was the maximum airspeed or ground speed of one of those?
Oh, it would have been about flight speed would have been about 80 miles an hour on the old, now the Cub, we used the Cub in the primary. And that was the most popular airplane used in all that. They built a lot of Cubs for this program. And then a lot of Wacos. Most of them used the Wacos, except we used the old Traveler.
Were they canvas covered wings or
Yes, yes.
were they safe?
Yeah, yeah. I think so. I didn't have it. Everything went fine to me. We got along real good with it.
Excuse me for interrupting you.
That's okay. Yeah, I understand. So anyway, at the end of that, that was 1940. I soloed in June of 1940. A thing that happened before that, I was in the had been in the National Guard since I was since 39, and I was going to college. I was taking this flight training. I had a job, and National Guard at that time we started maneuvers every weekend. At one time it was only once a month. And I hate to say I joined the National Guard not because I was really patriotic, it's because I made a little money out of it. But anyway, we would drill once a month. But at this time in 1940, we were starting to drill every weekend. So I just couldn't do everything. I couldn't take the flying, go to college, and go to drill. So I asked my commanding officer for a discharge. And when he handed me that discharge, he said, "That's the last one." They were, that year, they went to Places, Texas for their summer maneuvers. And they were mobilized and sent to the Aleutian Islands. So they spent the war in the Aleutians, my outfit did. But I was no longer in it. I got out of it in the spring of 1940. Then I started that secondary program, finished it, and I still wanted to fly, but I didn't know how I was going to do any more flying, so I tried the Navy. And the Navy, well, before this, when I was getting into the secondary program, I had to take a physical again, like I did for the primary. And I went to Springfield, Missouri to take the physical. Well, they turned me down on color vision. So I went back home, and I just went to Chanute, Kansas and took the physical. And they gave me a little different colorblind test. There's several kinds. And I could pass that one with some yarns. And I couldn't pass this book. But anyway, I was able to continue flying. So after the secondary CPT course, civilian pilot training, I didn't know what I was going to do. I still wanted to fly. So I tried the Navy in the fall of 1940. They turned me down for the color vision thing. Well, then in 1941, I heard about a committee known as the Clayton Knight Committee. It was recruiting pilots for the RAF, the British Air Force. So I heard about that, and they were in Kansas City. And I went up there for an interview. It was called the Clayton Knight Committee. Clayton Knight was an American who flew for the British in World War I. And he then was so patriotic towards Britain that he was recruiting American guys to fly for the British. Well, I took the physical and passed that. And but before I did that, I was in Kansas City. I went over to Fairfax Airport, Kansas City, took the Navy test again, and they turned me down. So I went out, and then they sent me out to the airport in Kansas City to take a check ride, and I was accepted for the British flight training, which took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I went down there and started flight training at Tulsa with RAF. And that went along pretty good. The only problem was a lot of the guys would take this training, and since we were not a belligerent nation, they didn't have to go. They'd quit. They'd get this flight training, and they wouldn't go. We would take the training, go to Canada, and end up in England. And I knew it was combat. That's what I wanted to do. But they came, and I was 19 years old then, and they came, and the British officers were interviewing all of us to see why we were in it. Well, I made the comment that I wanted to fly, and he said, well, supposing King George wants you to dig ditches. I knew what, I realized later that they were testing me, but I didn't know it then. And I said, well, no, I don't want to do that. I'll fly airplanes. And if I'd have said, you know, I want to kill Hitler or I want to fight for Britain, but I wasn't enthusiastic about talking to them. I wanted to, you know. But, so I went to the flight line next morning, and my name was removed from the flight line, and I was dismissed. So I went back home, and here now I'm back, and I got another job in an office, and that was driving me crazy. Airplanes flying over, and I want to be flying. I wrote back to Tulsa to ask them if I could get back in the program. And they said, your flight records here are fine, but the British don't like your attitude. So then I had heard about another civilian pilot training program, the third one, that was available. I contacted a professor at Haddon College, and he was now working for this civilian pilot training program. I said, can you get me in the cross-country instructor program? Well, he did. No, I went to Pittsburgh, Kansas, and there we got trained to train pilots in the Cub for elementary flying. We trained in the Waco to teach acrobatics, and we flew a Stinson, gull-wing Stinson, which was a 4-place passenger plane on cross-country and night flying. At the end of that time, I had an instructor's rating and was qualified for that. So this was 1942, spring of 42.
Where were you on Pearl Harbor Day?
Pearl Harbor Day, I was between the British training and this cross-country instructor course.
What was your feelings when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Well, I was working that day, that Sunday, we was working at this Long Bell Lumber Company, and we had worked on Sunday because it was the first of the month, and we always had to do a lot of extra work. And several of us were in the car, and we heard the announcement. And, you know, I really don't know what I thought. I knew I wanted to get back in flying somehow. And that's when I first ended up in the cross-country instructor course. And then I heard that they were hiring pilots for trained Air Corps cadets in Texas. And several of us went down, 4 of us went down together to Stamford, Texas, which is out in West Texas, just north of Abilene. And we were called civilian flight instructors. And they were subject to draft. We were just deferred because of essential war work. So we were interviewed and given a check ride, and we would be assigned 5 cadets. And I have a picture here that shows
Hold it up and
me meeting a class. These guys, these 5 of them, they were assigned to an instructor.
hold it right there.
And this is me standing there with my parachute, and my cadets meeting me on the first day of their arrival
That's good.
at Stanford. This program consisted of 10 weeks of flight training. They would solo in about 8 hours, and then at about 20 hours we would begin acrobatics, and that continued through till about 60 hours when they would graduate, and then go on to basic training and advanced training. But every 10 weeks we would get a new group of guys that had not flown before, and they would learn to fly there. We had, you know, anybody can learn to fly if you have time. But in this 10 weeks, they had to meet certain criteria. And if they didn't make that, couldn't do it, you just had, they would be eliminated. About 45 to 50% of these guys would not make it.
Was that-
High washout rate,
No,
because it was just a very strenuous training program. And I think probably the most interesting thing, one of the most interesting things that happened to me while I was instructing there, my flight commander called me in one day and said, I soloed this boy yesterday and he needs to get his second solo, but he wasn't able to do it, so he wanted me to take him out solo. So it was kind of a crude system of the dispatcher, between the dispatcher and us calling, and we called on this little radio, and I said, send cadet so-and-so to my airplane. And normally I would have a pre-flight talk with him, but why I did this, I don't know. And this boy came out and saluted, and I said, get in, let's go. So we went out and we flew around the pattern, and he didn't do a very good job. But I thought, well, my flight commander said he soloed him yesterday, I'll let him go. And I got out of the airplane and said, fly around the pattern. Well, he flew around, did a poor job of that, and this clobbered the airplane. So I called him in and I climbed up on the wing and I said, boy, didn't you solo yesterday? He said, no, sir, that's the first time I ever soloed. Well, the wrong boy had come out there. This kid had 12 hours of flight time and he hadn't soloed, and if you had 12 hours and hadn't soloed, you eliminated you. Well, the wrong one came out, and they called my commanding officer and said, told him what happened, and he said, well, Wyrick thinks you can teach him to fly, let him keep him. Well, it's too late, he's already got 12 hours, and I couldn't. I said, no, I'll just give him a bad ride, which he did, and they eliminated the poor guy. But anyway, that was my fault, you know. I should have had a conference with him before.
What percentage of planes would you lose? Do you have any?
Not many. We lost a few. We had one instructor that they were doing spins and they got in some kind of a hassle on controls, and they spun in. And we had a couple instructors. We didn't have a cadet with them. We would have cross countries at the end, kind of towards the end of the program, and we would send a cadet out solo around Texas out there, 3 or 4 places. And at the end of the flight, we'd send an airplane with 2 instructors in it to see that nobody was down anywhere and that they all made it. Well, they went over Spur, Texas, and they decided to give Spur an air show, these 2 guys did. And they did some acrobatics right over town, and they ended up too low and killed themselves. Just showing off, you know. There was 2 instructors together. That's a dangerous thing to have nobody in charge.
That's kind of like doctors flying airplanes.
Yeah. Well, I've known that. Yeah, that's true.
You got a picture of the kind of planes that you were
Yes.
using instructing?
These were PT-19s, Fairchild. A nice, easy flying airplane. It had a
That's good.
175 Ranger engine, which was a little underpowered. And the only thing that would cause would be, when you did acrobatics, you had to do it at about 4,000 feet. And if you did a few slow rolls and some snap rolls, you'd lose altitude. You have to climb back up, and that's the only problem. But it was a nice airplane for acrobatics. It was easy to handle. The old Traveler that I did acrobatics in secondary had big, heavy wings, and it was hard to do acrobatics in.
Did you do loops?
Oh yes.
Outside loops, inside loops?
The outside loop was just a maneuver that you would try to fool with just at the end of the program. There's not a normal maneuver that you would do outside loops, but you would do the regular loops. Shondels, pylon, and some lazy eights, and then snap rolls.
I remember reading the Jimmy Doolittle biography about his showing people that an outside loop could be done. People were just, and I assume the difference between an outside loop and an inside loop is for the pilots, either on the outside of the loop or on the inside of the loop. Is that right?
Yeah, it's very hard to do the outside loop because you're pushing the airplane around. It's easy to do an inside loop because you get some speed up, you pull the stick back, and you just go around and ease it out, you know. But to do an outside loop, you got to push the airplane over underneath and backovers. So it's hard to do.
When he did it for the first time, was it a test of the strength of the airplane, or the test of his strength?
Well, your strength, you could do it all right.
Not me.
It was probably the airplane test, because actually on an inside loop or anything that you did a lot of pressure pulling back on, it would cause you to blood to flow from your head and you would black out momentarily. But the outside loop would be the other way. That'd be pushing the blood to your head, so you wouldn't have to. It wouldn't be any stress on you, but it's a stress on the airplane, the outside maneuver. And we did some of that at the last of the class, where the cadets they would act like the instructor the last flight. The instructor would have to be the student. And we would do a few things like some outside maneuvers. But you did snap rolls and all precision. You could snap it around and stop, go around, and the slow rolls. And they had a maneuver called a Cuban 8, where you do a loop and roll it over in the middle and go back around and come with the bottom loop, make an 8. And there were several maneuvers you had to do, falling leaves. And let's see, where are we?
We're in April of 1942, was thereabouts.
Yeah, summer 42 was
The summer
the air
When was the 30 seconds over Tokyo? When it was in April of 42, was it not?
I believe it was, yes. Yes, you're right.
Do you remember how that impacted you? Did you just think that was miraculous?
No, the main thing I remember about those 42 and 43 is that we were getting whipped all over the world. I mean, the Pacific was, MacArthur was retreating, and I didn't. It was a pretty bleak feeling that you'd read the headlines and the things that were happening. And that's about all I knew about what I read in the paper. But I did feel the despair, what we were doing. But I was enjoying my work, my flight schedules, and we worked every day. I mean, every day the weather was good, we flew. It's not like an airline pilot. After I got to be an airline pilot, I had 2 on, 2 off, or something like that. But I can look at my logbook and see that it was an everyday deal that the weather was permitted. And in 1944, then, towards the end of 44, they had cut down on training air cadets. Air Corps didn't need as many. So they were beginning to close down the primary flight schools around the country. And I had, then I was either having, when they put us, I don't think I told you about in 1943, we were, up to that point, we were civilian flight instructors. We were not in the Air Corps. But the draft boards were drafting some of the instructors, so the Air Corps was going to lose their flight instructors, so they inducted us all into the Army Air Corps Enlisted Reserve. And that we were not commissioned. Now the Navy did commission some of the guys, but the Air Corps didn't. And we were just considered privates in the Air Corps Enlisted Reserve, but we were no longer subject to draft. We were in the Air Corps. But that took us away from the draft, and we were considered on inactive status for some reason or other. I don't know why, but so I never really had active duty according to my discharge. But anyway, they closed down the primary schools, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I either had to go to the Ferry Command or something like that, or an airline. But down in Sweetwater, they were training women, wasps. The women had gone through there and gotten primary training. They'd been out flying, ferrying airplanes and everything, and they were sending them back for an instrument rating. So I went down there to see about a job, and I got a job there as an instrument flight instructor. First, I got my Air Corps instrument rating, and then I was assigned 3 women, and I trained them for instrument flight. And that was in November of 1944. September and October, November. And in November, they were closing down also. And then while I was there, Eastern Airlines came out to Stanford looking for pilots, hiring pilots, and they sent a Captain Lambic. And I didn't interview with him because I thought, for one thing, the color vision would be a problem. And besides, airline flying sounded like a miserable job. It sounded like it's just boring as all get out. So I didn't put much stock in trying to get a job at the airline. But while we were at the end of the school there, the school told us, they said we could use any airplane we wanted to get our CAA instrument rating. We had Air Corps instrument ratings. So I would get a buddy and get a BT-13 there. We were flying the BTs. They were a little bigger than the primary. That was what they used. Basic flight training. Go over to Abilene and practice instrument flying. And the CAA guy that's called in instead of FAA, he came around and several of us got our instrument ratings. Well, that was a requirement of Eastern. You had to have your CAA instrument rating. The Air Corps instrument rating wasn't enough. You had to have an FAA rating, CAA rating. So I had that. I got that rating, and they sent the doctor. Then Eastern had a real fine medical department, and Dr. Edwards was sent out to give preliminary physicals to the people that the captain had interviewed. Well, he called me at my apartment where I was living, and he said, "Did you just get your instrument rating?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "How would you like to fly for Eastern?" And I said, "Well, I'll tell you, the Air Corps says I'm colorblind, have a color vision problem, and I didn't think it would do me any good to try." He said, "Come on out here, I'll check you." So I went out to the same place I'd taken Air Corps physicals, and he also gave me the yarn test. Are you familiar with the?
No.
They have a book called the Isochromatic Plates, and that you see numbers in. And if you're colorblind, you can't see some of them.
Okay.
But a yarn test, they'll put a bunch of yarns on a white sheet and give you a sack, and he picks up one yarn. Doesn't tell you what color it is. Say it's yellow. Pick up the yellow, and you say, "Pick up everything that's that color, or got that in it," and you throw it in the sack. Well, if you pick up yarn that's almost yellow but maybe green where they come close together, if you made a mistake, you can see it. Well, I could pass that test. He said, "Well, you're all right. You're colorblind. Go to Miami if you want a job at least." So I went home to Missouri for Thanksgiving. That was November 1944. And the day after Thanksgiving, I got on an airplane in Joplin, went to St. Louis, and that's the first Eastern airplane I saw. Was in St. Louis. I went to Miami and took the tests that they gave, the mental tests, stuff like that. And I was hired by Eastern Airlines in November 1944. And I had a long career there, 36 years. 2.5 years in New York, 19 in New Orleans, and I was in Miami 1 year, and then came to Atlanta in 1966. And had to retire in 1980 because I was the mandatory retirement age of 60 for airline pilots. So.
Did you know Eddie Rickenbacker?
Mm-hmm. Very well, Captain Eddie for the wheel slot. And,
Captain.
Pardon?
What'd you say, Captain Eddie?
Captain Eddie, he's known as Captain
Oh,
Rickenbacker.
okay.
He had a ranch out in Texas, so when I was in New Orleans, we were flying over to the Texas area, and he flew the slot there.
No.
In fact, one time before that, though, I was in Washington National, and I'd gotten off the airplane and was going up in the lobby for something, and I ran up these steps, and this guy was walking up. These men were walking up the steps, and I made the corner a little short, and I hit this fella's briefcase. And I looked up and it was Captain Eddie, my boss. And I bumped into him. I was in uniform and everything, you know. And I was just in one of my probably the first year I was with the airline.
Now, he had been an ace in World War.
He what?
He had been an ace in World War I.
Yes, he was a World War I ace. He flew for France. So he went over there.
The escadrille.
Yes, he was in France.
Okay.
Yes, I knew him. He knew just about everybody in the airline. Of course, we were pretty small then, because when I went to work for Eastern, I was number about number 470, I think, in the pilot ranks. And got down to about 400 when we took on Colonial. I went to 430 something. But of course, when Eastern went down, we had about 5,000 pilots.
When he was in the ocean, didn't his plane crash? Or
During World War II, he was doing some kind of, I'm not sure what it was for, something for the government. And he was in a military airplane, and they went down the Pacific. And he spent several days in a raft.
No. Did he ever talk about that?
No, I never heard him talk about it. No. He did, you know, I say I knew it. He was in the airplane with us.
Excuse me just a minute. Go ahead.
Captain would ride with us on the airplane, and he'd just ride in the cockpit there sometimes, but I don't really remember what conversation was about. I know he rode with us quite a bit.
Delta Airlines was getting started about that time also, was it not?
Delta was about 1 year after Eastern.
Okay,
When
Eastern.
in the 28, Eastern started about 28, I think Delta 29.
Okay.
But see, I wasn't there until 1944. So. And Captain Eddie came in the airline about 38 when he came with Eastern, took over.
So then you spent your career with Eastern Airlines, the jet age, you saw that?
Yeah, started in DC-3s. That was the first airplane I flew. I flew out of New York, flew to Atlanta. And
How long did that take?
how long did what take?
Yeah.
Well, we landed a lot, you know. We didn't
Yeah.
have any non-stops. We'd go to Washington and Raleigh and Greenville and different places. And usually, one of my trip I remember the most, I'd leave at about 10 o'clock at night in New York and get in here in the morning, and then stay all day, and then the next night go back to New York. It was night flights. But that particular ones I remember. And I had something that might be interesting with the airline. I flew with a fellow that I can tell this story now, but seemed like things didn't go right with us all the time. Didn't seem like he was a very good pilot. My captain. We were going into Greenville one night and making a circling approach. The wind was so we had to circle the airport. And he wasn't lined up, and I said, do you see the runway? And he said, no. And I said, well, you're going to have to bend it around. So he bent it around pretty tight. And I didn't see how we were going to land because we were hanging at the head of the airport about a 45-degree angle. Boy, he put that old DC-3 down on the concrete. And I thought we were going to go over in the grass and just put the rudder in, and we slid down the runway. And that was kind of got me a little nervous, you know. And then we were coming out of Miami one day, and it was a lot of smoke and stuff. And we had been on an IFR flight plan, and he said cancel the flight plan. Well, I did, and we were supposed to be landing at West Palm Beach. And we were on approach, and I told the tower we were on base leg, and they said, we don't see you, Eastern. I said, well, we're about ready to turn final. I said, I still don't see you. Well, they should have seen us. About the time we were touching down, I realized we were on the wrong airport. And I said, Captain, I think we're landing on the wrong airport. Well, he just went ahead and landed. And we taxied in, we land west, which is the same way as the runway was after West Palm.
Yeah.
We taxied southeast, and an Air Force Jeep says, follow me, came out. Well, we were on Boca Raton, this was 1944. It was still an active military base. So we landed on an active military base with an airliner full of passengers. We were always full then because of priority seating, 21 seats. And so we followed that Jeep till we got to the end of the runway, and he just turned around. I looked out, and those old soldiers, their mouths are all open, you know. He just put the tire on, we took off. So we landed at West Palm. The agent came out and said, y'all land at West Palm Beach? And the captain said, yeah. He said, Miss Shannon, who was vice president in Miami, said, Miss Shannon wants you to call him when you get to New York. So when we got to New York, I went on home to my apartment. I got a call from my captain. He said, I told him we tried to call that tower and we didn't have the reservation, or didn't have the frequency. I said, well, I'll tell him whatever you say. But nobody ever asked me anything. He got grounded for about a week or something. And then the next thing we did was we were landing at Greenville. And he always made kind of a long, low approach. And first I thought we'd go hit these wires, you know, and we missed those, and we hit kind of a levee and bounced in the air. And I thought, gosh, we need to check the wheels, see if they're still on this thing. And I looked out, and mine was still there. Everybody went ahead and landed. And I told him then, I said, Captain, we alternated every other leg, Eastern with Eastern. The captain fly one leg, co-pilot fly the next. I said, I don't want to land the airplane anymore. I think this thing's, we might have damaged it. So he said, okay. We got to New York, and he told him we made a hard landing, which he's supposed to report. And a couple of days later, I was back here in Atlanta, and I saw that airplane in the hangar, number 360. I remember it to this day. And I said, why is that airplane in the hangar? Mechanic said, it was sitting on the ramp, and it looked like one of the wings was drooping a little bit. Well, they had got in there in this wing center section. Had a bunch of the bolts were kind of ripped out, and it was. So I said then, you know, I'll never. That's a good lesson for me. Anytime I make a hard landing or anything, I'll be sure they know about it.
Yeah.
Real sure. So I went to the crew scheduler then the next day, and I said, who am I going with next trip? And he told me, and I said, no, I'm not. The guy said, well, you have to talk to Johnny Gill, who's my chief pilot. I said, I'll tell you, I'm going home, and if you call me and check me for a trip with this guy, I'll talk to Johnny Gill. But they never did schedule me again. I don't know whether I'll be telling this stuff.
Did you fly the Electra?
I flew the Electra. And
it had some controversy about it before.
Yes, it had a problem with what they call the sympathetic harmonic something or other, where the jet engine and the props and the turbulence would get into harmony, and a wing would fall off.
That's not safe.
They had two of those. Braniff lost one, and I believe American lost one.
No.
But I flew the Electra, and you know they finally beefed up the wings, and that was a good airplane. But it just was. It came at the same time the jets did, and that's where Eastern made a mistake. We were flying Electras against Delta jets, and one reason, I don't know if this is, one reason Delta got some jets that Eastern was supposed to get, Rickenbacker wouldn't take them because they didn't have the engines he wanted. He wanted a bigger engine than him, he turned them down. This is the way I remember the story. So we ended up with the Electras, and Delta was really beating us to death with their jets.
And when did you start flying jets?
I started after the prop jet. We had the 727 was my first jet I flew in 1969, and I flew the 727 for about 10 years, and then I checked on the L-1011 in 1976 or 74, and flew it the last 6 years with Eastern.
What's the worst thing that ever happened to you flying?
Well, I had one small accident when I was in the primary training program, the cadets. It was a real windy day, and the airplane started a ground loop, which means it's going to circle around on the ground. And both of us, the cadet hit the brake the same time I did, and it made it go up on its nose and hit the prop and broke the prop. And that's the only accident I ever had there. I never had any accidents with Eastern. A couple of near misses with other airplanes. And
how did that occur?
well, one of them was in Baton Rouge, and we took off in the weather, and this was just a light plane that was messing around. Shouldn't have been where it was. And I saw him through the clouds, and we missed him. I had a Navy airplane come very close and taken out of Corpus Christi. we were climbing out and he was coming, and he went right behind me. And I could see him and the pilot in the cockpit. He was going to the Naval Air Base. I could see his head down. And they called me and wanted to know if I was going to file an incident. And I said, well, no, he missed us. You know, yeah. What had happened, he had a gear problem. And he had his head down and wasn't looking. That was a pretty close call. But for the most part, other than a few engine failures, had very, very little problem.
When you heard about 9/11,
I couldn't. That's a horrible thing to think about.
could you fathom that it had happened?
Did you what?
Could you even imagine?
No, no. And I just can't imagine those guys. You know what's going on in their minds when these guys were attacking them in the cockpit. That's terrible.
Did you ever experience rowdiness on the airplanes from the passengers that required you to get out of the cockpit, or did you?
Yes, I had some incidents. I had a man, he was being vulgar to another man's wife, and we just had the police meet. I just called the police and I asked the guy if he wanted to press charges, and the man, and he said yes, so I called the police. I stayed out of it, you know. I just had the man that was pressing charges. And I had a lady one time, you could only take a dog on the airplane and one in each cab. There's some rules about how many dogs you can have. If you have a little dog, you could put him in a little cage and keep him under the seat. Well, this girl came up and said the lady has a dog out in her lap, and I ended up having to go back. And I said, you need to keep the dog in. She said, I will not put this dog in that cage. And I began to feel kind of small, you know, because I didn't know what. I could have said we're going to land, and that was from LA to Atlanta. So I'm going to land in Dallas and throw you off, but I couldn't do that. And so I finally I asked the people around her, I said, do you think, is it all right with you? And they said, yeah, it didn't matter. I thought later what I could have said, it won't be any food served on the dog's out. But and I guess the closest thing I had with an engine failure was in Fort Lauderdale. We had a full passenger on 1011 going to Toronto, and we lost an engine just prior to liftoff. They come to the point where you either have to go or not go, and it was the point just that we had to stop. So it took a almost panic stop, and thrust and brakes, and taxed it in, and tires all went flat because they had a melt-out plug in them. Anyway, that was pretty close, but we lost an engine just to take off. But that was pretty rare.
I was dumbfounded by the stability of the nose wheel of this plane that landed in Los Angeles this last year, where it was at 90 degrees to what it was supposed to be. I didn't realize that the nose gear could withstand that kind of.
That surprised me too. I thought it would have crumpled.
But they must be pretty well secured. At least on that plane, it was well secured to allow it to land. But it wasn't rolling, basically.
No, it wasn't anything. Yeah, it was sideways.
It was sideways on the thing. Do you think that the steps that they've taken to secure the cockpits from hijackers are adequate now?
I would think so. Of course, I've not been in an airplane hardly. My son's a pilot of Northwest. He flies out of Detroit overseas, and he seems to think it's pretty adequate. I believe it is.
Do you have any thoughts about the pilots being allowed to carry firearms?
I think it should be all right if they're trained and use firearms. I don't think I'd have any problem with it. I carried it. The only time I ever had a firearm was in the National Guard. I dealt with them then, but I never had one otherwise.
Did you get married during the war? Or
I got
Very
married
hefty.
in 1944, January of 1944, while I was still in Texas, while I was still instructing down there. My brother was getting married. I was going to be his best man. I borrowed an airplane from a friend and flew up to Missouri, and that's where I met her at his wedding.
I see.
And she was maid of honor, and I was best man.
That's a great story.
So we got married in 1944, and we'll have 63 years next January.
That's great.
Then we went to New York that first year too. Marriage. Our big year came to the airline same year.
What'd you feel about when you heard the atomic bomb had been dropped?
Well, of course, I agreed that it needed to be done. Did anything that would end that conflict. Even though I felt bad that we had, people killed and everything, but I felt good.
I mean, you got your first job in part because of Roosevelt. What was your reaction when you heard he had passed away?
Oh, I had a lot of respect for him.
Yeah.
And this, my discharge, I don't think I was ever qualified for a GI Bill and all that stuff. But I felt like I got my GI Bill before.
It sounded
Because
like
they provided me with, just flight training that I could never have paid
Yeah.
for. I couldn't even buy a football, as you know. And so the government provided me with my career.
What was your final seniority rating with Eastern Airlines when you
I think
retired?
I was about 17 on the seniority list.
Oh, you've been there.
I retired.
Are there any thoughts that you have that you would like to pass on that we've not talked about your life, career, World War I, two things that molded your opinion? You'd like to pass on to your children and grandchildren, because they'll be watching this someday to see where great-granddaddy and granddaddy was.
Well, I felt very fortunate that with the color vision problem that I had, that I was able to keep going. And then I would take a physical, and my doctor would say, well, you've got a lot of time, and we just ignore it. And I went to my first physical in New Orleans when I went to Dr. Cole down there. When I called him, he said, you know I'm tough, don't you? So I didn't know whether I want to take physical from him or not, but he just kind of sloughed off the color vision thing. And then one day I went in there after about 12 years with Eastern, and he said, well, Wyrick, I knew he had something on his mind. And he said, you're going to have to either pass this test or get a waiver from the FAA. So Fort Worth takes care of, Oklahoma City, they have their medical center out there, the FAA does. And they made arrangements that I would take a practical test, color vision test. So what I did, I was flying captain by then. I was on a trip to Houston to San Antonio. The FAA guy met me there, the inspector. We met in his office first, and I had to look at charts and tell him different maps or altitude, certain color, as altitudes change, they come different colors. Have to read the little numbers, and then we prearranged with the tower to shoot green, red, and white lights at me. And we were sitting in the car, and the tower would click that light. Even though we never used lights, that was something way back in the old days you used, and no time in the airline did I ever use a light. And but I had to identify those lights, which I did. The FAA guy wouldn't say okay if it was green. He wouldn't say yes or no. And after about several minutes, he had him stop, and we started driving in. He said, well, I'm sorry, Ed. And then he said, no, you're okay. I'm not going to tell you what I thought of calling him. But so what I did then, in the airplane, I had to point out different kinds of fields, whether they were plowed,
Yeah.
whether it was a forest, where I would put that airplane if I had a forced landing. And then we got to San Antonio, and by then it was dark, and I had to point out all the lights on the field,
Yeah.
what color they were. And then I got a slip on my physical. It said, deficient according to the pseudo-isochromatic plates, no restrictions. So from then on, I didn't have to, if they gave me a colorblind test, I'd say I don't have to take that.
Any other thoughts?
No, I guess not. I appreciate the chance to tell this story. There were a whole lot of guys. Well, one thing, there's a book that's put out by this Dominic Pisano. He's a curator, or he's at the Smithsonian, called Fill the Sky with Pilots.
Oh, that's your program, okay.
And that's that program, and
Yeah.
it's all the details that went into the problems of getting it through the Congress. And there's statistics on how many pilots were trained. We were training, the Air Corps was training, I believe, 200 or 300 pilots a month. I mean, a year in 1939. And I just copied a little bit out of there. In 1939, the Air Corps set a goal to train 1,200 pilots a year. Before 39, the Air Corps produced an average of 200 flying cadets a year. In the year from July 1942 to July 1943, in the aviation cadet training program that I was involved in, 4,124 cadets were trained every month
Good Lord.
in the year,
Yeah.
just that 1 year,
Yeah.
42 to 43. And then in December of 1940, after Pearl Harbor, December the 12th of 41, they changed this program to call the WTS, or War Training Service. Prior to that time, when I got into it, we didn't have to sign up for military service. After the Pearl Harbor, this program was called, when it was called WTS, they had to agree to military service. Of course, I wanted it. I tried
Yeah.
my best to be a combat pilot.
Well, on behalf of myself, my generation, and future generations, Ed, we want to express our sincere appreciation to you for the time you spent making it possible for people like me to go to grammar school over here during the time you were out in Texas training pilots. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you.